All right, guys, welcome back. Now, I think this video might be the video everybody's been waiting on, but before we get into that, let's go over what we did in the last video. Now, one of the main things we did was make the SRT4 cluster fit in the Dakota dash, which was no easy task. A lot of this had to be cut up just to fit in here, but it fits. And then, like we covered in the last video, I have the full SRT4 dash harness in here, and it's tied to the harness in the engine bay. And then one thing I did off camera was a set of Pro Sport digital gauges. So we got wideband boost and oil pressure right here where the head unit is supposed to go. We're not worried about a radio right now. And you can see the bed is off the frame, which shout out to my awesome wife for helping me manhandle that thing off the frame. But as you can see, I got the frame all cleaned up. Now, it definitely didn't start this way. It was pretty nasty, mostly covered in mud, believe it or not. But I started out by stripping all the parts off of it I didn't need, like the old exhaust, the shocks, got the whole rear end out of it. And then I just went over it with the wire brush real quick, try to get as much of the loose stuff off of it. And once I got that done, went a step further on stripping the frame and got rid of the stock leaf spring hangers. And I just cut the heads of the rivets off, pounded the hanger off, and then pushed the rest of the rivet through the frame. Then from there, it was time to actually clean the frame up and get it ready for paint. And basically I did the same thing as I did on the front half, which is wire wheel it with a drill. And this time I used a vacuum as I went along, and as I wire wheeled it, I vacuumed the dust to try to keep the dust down in the garage, because the last time when I did the front, this whole garage was full of just brown dust. So vacuum worked awesome. It kept the dust way down. Then I just brushed on this rust converter. This is from Amazon. It's just regular old rust converter, nothing fancy. Brushes on really nice. And then after that, I just top coated with Rust-Oleum satin black spray paint, which kind of gives it this nice OEM sheen. Now, the frame is not perfect. I didn't go crazy on making it smooth or anything like that. I just simply got the loose stuff knocked off and coated it. And then from there, I was able to get the Beltec drop hangers on there. So now the frame is ready for the fuel tank to go back in, which is the last thing we need to finally fire this thing. We need a fuel system. So the goal in this video is get the pump installed in the factory fuel tank, get the feed and return lines ran to the engine bay, and get a fuel pressure regulator mounted on the engine bay, and hopefully we could start this thing. Since we had the dash harness all done in here, I was able to plug in the laptop with the HP tuners. We got the stock tune file off the factory SRT4 PCM, sent that off to the tuner, and he has already sent me back a base map. So we have power, we have grounds, we have a starter, we have gauges, we have ignition, we just need fuel. So the first thing we need to do is take this outside and clean it off because it's covered in mud. And once we get it all cleaned up, we can pull the hanger out of here and hopefully swap in our pump. All right, we got a fuel pump housing here, and the fuel pump's down in here, so we need to separate the two halves. So we should be able to just release these little tabs here. And I just release this connector. There's a little tab you pull up and it releases that notch. Okay, I depend that connector of the level sensor so I could pop this little notch here and slide it out of the housing just so it's out of the way. All right, I got the housing apart. Basically, this piece is snapped in here and it's held in by two clips down in that hole. And there's those clips right there. So you have to release those tabs through the bottom and that whole thing comes out. And then the pump is sandwiched between the two. So here's the pump. So now I'm going to take this apart and try to fit my AEM 340 pump in there. All right, guys, it's been about an hour. Let me show you what I got going on. So this is the factory pump that sits inside of this canister. And you can see this thing gets fuel two ways, from the bottom through the sock and also through the side, because it's contained inside of this unit here. So what happens is the return line puts fuel into this canister so it can feed the pump, while also the pump can get fuel from the bottom of the tank. Well, first off, this pump sits really high off of this bottom here, whereas the AEM does not have this section. That's the first problem. Second problem is this is a center feed. The AEM pump is off to the side. You see that? It's off to the side there. So once I got the pump fitted into the bottom of that case using the factory rubber piece that sits around the pump here, there's a rubber grommet, and I took it off of this one, put it onto the AEM pump, and it fits super snug up there. But I needed a way to hold the pump in place. So you see I have that bolt that runs through the housing and a hose clamp to the pump. So you can see that bolt head right there. That keeps the pump from falling out of that plastic housing. So that worked out, got it in there nice and secure. But then with this pump sitting in the factory spot up top, it sat way too high up in this housing. So I had to cut this whole bottom off. You see it sits like this. There's no way this sock would reach the bottom of the tank because that sits like that to the bottom of the tank. This sock would sit way up here. So that wasn't gonna work, so I cut it off. And what I did was put a bolt in there, kind of like I did for the pump to hold it in place. So this is a stop. So when I put this in the tank, you can see it stops the sock from sitting on the bottom of the tank and gives the tiniest bit of air gap. That way this sock does not sit flat against the bottom of the tank, and it can suck in fuel from all sides. I didn't want it resting on the bottom of the tank. I just felt like it wouldn't be a good idea, so that's what this stop is for. We'll keep it sitting just like that with the tiniest bit of gap. So other than that, the only other issue was now the fuel level sensor was going to be sitting at the wrong spot, the float, because we took all this material off. What it came out to be is about 3/4 of an inch difference. So up here, there's a little spacer, and that spacer slides out once you slide this out. And once it was out, I cut 3/4 of an inch off and slid it back on there. Then I sat the sensor up here because I needed to put a notch for it to lock in place, kind of like it does there. So I just used my Dremel, made a little notch right there. That way when I slid this in, it locked in place. So now the float will sit at the proper level, just like it was before. So I had to put a new fuel line in there. The factory one just wasn't gonna work. So that's fuel injection hose with some nice clamps. It got a little twist in it. That way this can move up and down like it's supposed to. So now I would say this thing is ready to go back in the tank. All I gotta do now is clean it out. Now, hopefully that all made sense. I know there's a lot of changes that we had to make to the pump housing, and I was really hoping that that AEM pump would just slide in the factory spot in place of this pump, but just wasn't gonna happen. But we made it work. Let me know what you guys think of my hack job. I think we'll be okay. All right, we got the fuel tank back in. I wiped it out. It's all good to go. Got brand new straps holding the tank in. Then I went ahead and got the back half of the wiring harness back in here. So now we would be ready to put this pump housing in there, but there's a couple things I want to change. Number one, this fuel line that I use to bridge the gap between the pump housing and the pump is not submersible fuel line. So we got to change that. Second, I don't like the 14 gauge wire from the pump going to 16 gauge wire to the top of the housing. I'd rather run 10 gauge all the way through this directly to the pump, because when we make the relay harness, we're going to run 10 gauge power wire from that stud over there all the way to a relay, and then from the relay to the pump. So I got some wiring stuff coming to finish all that up, so we'll go over that more later. But for now, we can get the fuel lines ran. We can go ahead and just throw this in there temporarily so we know where our lines go. And what we got here is a regulator, filter, and PTFE line, all from Evil Energy. Now, Evil Energy actually reached out and said they liked what we're doing with the truck and they wanted to help out. So I gave them a list and that's what they sent me. So they also gave me a code for you guys to use, code Anthony at checkout, and it saves 10% on your entire order. And every time you guys do that, it supports me and the truck. So I think the first thing we're gonna do is figure out where this regulator is gonna go and get that mounted so that we can start running lines. We'll have to mount the filter on the frame rail somewhere. And after that, we just start making lines. Now we're kind of running low on real estate in here. We got a lot of junk, so I'm thinking it's gonna have to be something like that. On this regulator, we got an in and out and an in and out, and then our return. So we can use either of these for the in, and then we have our single return. So that should work out. We can come in and then back out. So let me figure out a way to mount this, and I'll show you guys what I come up with. All right, regulator's mounted. I went ahead and installed the gauge into the regulator. We have this port blocked off. We got a straight fitting coming out of here and a 90 coming out of the bottom. So the way this is gonna work is, I think on the rail, right here is gonna be our feed. So the line coming back from the pump will go into this one. And then up here, this side's gonna be our return. So I'm gonna make our first line, and it's gonna go from this return port around into the inlet of the regulator. So the fuel pressure will be controlled after the fuel rail. So fuel will go into the rail, through the return, back to the regulator, and this will regulate the pressure at the rail. And then we'll just make a return line that goes down back to the tank. So like I said, we're gonna make that return line first from the rail. So I got my -6 PTFE line, and I know that fitting ends right about there, and we need to come around to something like that. So I think that looks pretty good right there. I want to take this piece of tape and just wrap it around. And let's see, so right there comes around the intake manifold, goes to the inlet port on the regulator. So I'm just going to make a line. So that's where our first cut's going to be. Now there's multiple ways you can cut this line, but I prefer just the cutoff wheel. It gives a nice clean cut. So now with that cut, if you got any little strays, you can clip those off. And then Evil Energy includes a reamer tool. Get in there and open that PTFE line back up. So now with our fitting, we're going to unscrew the collar. And we're going to need these two pieces first. First thing we're going to do is slide this collar around the braided part of the hose, the outside of the hose. And then before we can insert this, we actually need to put it between the steel braid and the PTFE in there like that. So what you're going to want to do is gently open up the braids away from the line inside. Then once you get all that braid flared away from that inner sleeve, you want to install this, and you want to make sure you get under the braid but around this inner line. It's very important that you make sure none of the braid gets between this and the inner sleeve. Then once you're sure you got it in there, where none of the braid is between the two, we can just press it on. And you want to press it till that PTFE inner sleeve is butted right up against the bottom of that, just like that. So now we got the other end of our fitting in the vise. I'm going to put a little silicone spray on the threads. Then we're going to press this on here. And then start our nut. Like that. Now we can use a wrench to tighten this thing up. And if you're one of those that cares about the finish of your AN fittings, use an AN wrench. But I don't have one, so I'm using just a regular wrench with some tape on it. And there we go, there's our first fitting. Now I'm going to knock out this other side. All right, first line is done. Now I did blow this out. I sprayed a little sea foam through there and then used compressed air to blow it out. That way we make sure we have no junk in there. So this is going to run through here under the manifold. And this side will connect to our regulator. All right, first line is done. Okay, now before we continue with the lines, let's go ahead and get our fittings on the pump. Luckily for me, my fuel pump housing has a feed and return already in it, so that makes things easy. And what we have is a couple more fittings from Evil Energy, and these are O-ring fittings that will slide over here and convert this quick disconnect to -6 line. So we have a 3/8 and a 5/16. So basically you have your collar with the threads on it, slides on the back, and then this side threads in like this, and same thing for this side, the return. So now we have our feed and return -6 lines. So I think what I'm going to do next is go ahead and do the return line to the regulator back here. Then after that, we can mount the filter on the frame and do our feed lines. All right, I got my return line ran down the frame up to the regulator. So now I think next we're going to go ahead and get the filter mounted on the frame rail. Now, one thing I didn't notice is this did not come with AN adapters. They're all barb fitting adapters. I believe this needs 10 O-ring to -6 adapters. So ordered those, but we can go ahead and get this mounted so at least we can get our feed line from the pump to the filter done and from the filter to the fuel rail. So I'm thinking something like this up on the frame. I know it might not be ideal to have it on the outside because you probably be able to see it, but serviceability wise, it'll be nice having it right here as opposed to on the inside of the frame. So I think I like that. I'm going to mount it right there, and then we can get our lines made. All right, filter's mounted. So I think my first line I'm going to make is the line from the filter up to the fuel rail. All right, guys, got both fuel lines done. So there's a feed and return, go down the frame rail. And then I got my fittings for the fuel filter. So we got our feed line into the filter, and then the feed line goes up to the fuel rail. And then this one up here is the return. Then the feed line comes up from the frame rail, goes into the fuel rail. And then you guys saw the return comes out there, goes to our regulator, and then the return from the regulator goes back down to the frame rail. So now it's time to wire. So here's our fuel pump relay harness, and it's got a 10 gauge power wire to the pump. And then we're going to use this bulkhead to put in the housing so we can run the 10 gauge directly to the pump instead of through the factory connector. So then we'll just use this 2-pin connector when it comes out of the pump, then wire this to the harness, and then of course we're going to switch that hose that's inside the canister to the submersible hose from Evil Energy, of course. So let me pull that housing out. We can do the wiring on that, do the hose, and then I'll run the relay harness. So you can see how the wiring is now. The pigtail from the AEM splices into the pigtail from the Dakota, and these wires are tiny. And those aren't very big either, so we're going to try to lose as much of this as possible and add as much of this as we can. And of course, we're going to swap this hose out real quick. All right, I got that grommet in there. I went right down the middle of the housing, right down inside there. I had to clear some of that webbing out of there, but it fit perfectly right down in the center. So that should be good. So that's going to give our power and ground directly to the pump, and we'll just use this for the level sensor. All right, got the pump housing all done. Got my line in there. Got the new wiring down to the pump, through there, through the grommet. So I think this thing is ready to go back in the tank. Now, one thing I did add is I plastic welded those little wings back on the pump housing, just like it was factory. Should help with slosh, and also allows this to sit more square in the bottom of the tank. And you see that sock has just the tiniest bit of air gap underneath it, so it's not sitting on the bottom of the tank. But let's throw it in. And fuel pump housing is in. I went ahead and put the filler neck on. Got the relay harness all done. So now when you turn the key and the factory fuel pump relay kicks power back here, it'll trigger this relay, which will send power from the battery right to the pump. So I think what's next is I'm going to hook up the battery and turn the key and see if the pump primes. All right, here we go. Not sure if you guys can hear that, but a successful first test, the pump did prime. So next, I still got to put fuel in it, but I want to get some oil pressure built up. So I'm going to pull the fuse out of the power wire for the fuel pump. I have the plugs out of the engine still. I'm going to pull the oil feed line from the turbo, put that in a water bottle or something, and I'm going to crank it over until we get some oil coming out of the oil feed. Because once we have that, then we know we have oil pressure. Well, we're not getting any oil out of the oil feed, so I just don't think it's enough RPM. So what we're going to do is go ahead and try to start it and watch the gauge, and if the gauge doesn't read anything, then we know we have a problem. All right, just flashed the tune on the computer. I got a few gallons of 93 in here, so I'm going to cycle the key, prime the fuel system a little bit, make sure there's no leaks, and then we're going to try to start. You ready? Okay. Had one leak, fixed it. If I don't get oil pressure, I'm killing it. If it starts. It's rich, super rich. All right, guys, after that very chaotic first start, let's recap what happened and where we're at. So I mentioned I did have a fuel leak. It was this fitting down there. I just didn't have it tight and tightened it up, and then no fuel leaks anywhere else. So that worked out. As far as oil pressure goes, we were seeing 60 plus PSI on the gauge, so we're good there. But even after running it, I pulled this feed line off the turbo and I still had no oil up here. So I left it loose, started again, and it started pouring out. So I think maybe it was airlocked or something, but now we have oil through the turbo. Now you may have noticed in that video of it running, it was not running exactly right. It had a real loud thump to it. Now I didn't really have a chance to dive into why it was running like that. I was just happy it started and I had other things to do. But thinking about it overnight, so now it's the next morning and I thought, well, I'm gonna pull the plugs. I pulled all 4 plugs out. Number 3 and number 4 were wet, covered in fuel. So looking back at the footage, if you have an eagle eye, you'll notice I had the plug wires for number 3 and number 4 swapped. But that's what happens when you rush. I was rushing to get this thing together. You know, I was cranking it with no plugs in it to try to get oil pressure up. Then I threw the plugs in it and I threw the plug wires on and I just missed it. I just swapped 2 plug wires, but now she's running real nice. So much better now, right? So now I'm pumped. It's super loud, so I definitely need to get some exhaust on it, but I'm going to do a cutout just for having loud mode if I want it. So tons more to do back here on the frame to get this all back together before we can drive it, but it's time to start cracking on just this nonsense junk. Need to clean and repaint the rear end and leaf springs. I got energy suspension bushings to go in there, and we're going to do the Jeep Liberty rear disc swap as well as 5-lug swap. So got that to do. We can get that back in there, get the bed back on, then it's time to drive it. And don't forget, if you need anything fuel system related, you need catch cans, hoses, vacuum lines, any stuff like that, go shop at Evil Energy and make sure you use my code Anthony at checkout to save 10%. Appreciate you guys for watching. I hope the build up for the first start has been worth it. I know it's been a ton of videos, but it's just me working on this thing in my spare time. But I'm super anxious now to get it done so I can start driving it, because summer's here. It's time to get this thing on the road. Appreciate you guys for watching. I'll see you on the next one.